This is a very short piece. It's very short. In the book I've written, I think, about 3,500 words. It's called The Genesis of the Prisoner, Who Created the Prisoner. I've perhaps got quotes from between 20 and 30 interviews on this, and at first glance it may seem an obvious question, because we all know it was Patrick McGoohan that created the prisoner. Well, when the society started, we wrote to McGoohan, the three of us, Judy, Roger and I, and we sent over our personal thoughts and asked McGoohan if he would be honorary presidency. Within 2 weeks he'd written back a cablegram saying yes. Shortly after that, Roger Goodman contacted the script editor, George Markstein, and Markstein responded to a voicemail on Roger's landline the same day. Now, McGoohan was in America, Markstein was in London, and Markstein was at pains to point out that the prisoner had been his idea. Well, I've done a lot of research on this, a lot of work. It's true that Markstein joined Danger Man for the aborted last colour series of 2 episodes. It's true that he knew all about spies. That was his area, his field of interest. He wasn't born until the 1930s, so he learned about all the activities of spies in the war many years later. But one of the things he came across was this remote establishment in Scotland called Inverlair Lodge, where they sent people who had knowledge in their heads that may be of value to an enemy. It was called the Cooler. So they were sent there until the information no longer mattered. So he did mention that to McGoohan. And of course he became the script editor, and along with David Tomblin he wrote Arrival, the draft episode that sets the scene. But McGoohan had been speaking with others well before. While Danger Man was still going on, he had been reading books, meeting people involved in the world of spies to find out what happened to spies who retired. It was Louis Griefer, who wrote The General, who introduced the two men and got them together, and initially they worked quite well. But I'll just read out some of the things that Griefer said about The Prisoner and the show's direction. Pat kept introducing things which I thought was great. That's what made the series memorable. It could have been, if George had had his way, a very good adventure series. What Pat did was make it much more than that. George's conception of the prisoner was entirely realistic, and Patrick's was fantastic. And George questioned the changes Pat made because he thought it was cheapening his idea. He was very much against the development of the way the series was going, which was very much Pat's doing, and from his point of view was elevating the series into an idiom of man's allegorical story, and the allegorical elements George hated, never did like them. He was a writer who has some experience about spies, knew all about the spy scene, and wrote about spies. Ever after, whenever Markstein was asked about the prisoner, he would say his idea didn't go the way it should have done as he envisaged it, of the prisoner going out into the world and finding everywhere a prison. When he was asked in one documentary who was number one, he said, well, there's no mystery about that. It's the man in charge. Listen, if the prisoner had been left to George Markstein, we wouldn't be discussing it now. One man wanted a spy series, the other an escape from a spy series. And McGowan said, he said, Mark Stein thought, despite any amount of dissuasion, that it's got to be an extension of Danger Man. Well, he should have realised, because he wrote Free for All at the same time as Arrival was being written, and he'd had the idea years before. He'd been to Portmeirion in '59 to film Danger Man. The idea was already in his head for whenever he could get the funding to do it. So in my view, you could say that Mark Stein contributed, but the creator is, as we believed back at the beginning, and I now emphatically state, it's 100% entirely down to McGowan's vision. What we got was McGowan's vision, and it had been in his head for a long time. It grew, but he instinctively knew where he was going.